The air is cold and heavy over the English Channel in the grim autumn of 1940. Below, the gray waves churn. Above, a small formation of British bombers flies a straight, predictable line. This is the doomed formation of an unescorted patrol. They are slow. They are loud. They are carrying a heavy bomb load. Every man aboard knows they are not flying a patrol. They are flying a target. This is the stage for a massacre, and they are the main act. Before the war, the strategists and engineers made a fatal mistake. They truly believed the new generation of bombers, planes like the Wellington, Hampden, and Blenheim, were fast enough and had enough defensive firepower to protect themselves. The doctrine was arrogant. Speed and altitude were the only escort needed. It was an absolute myth. The moment the first Allied bomber formations met the German fighters in real combat, the theory collapsed, costing hundreds of lives. Their executioners were not slow, clumsy interceptors. The enemy was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the fastest, most effective fighter aircraft in the world at that time. The 109 was a true weapon of war, built for speed, armed with cannons and heavy machine guns, and designed to climb far higher than any bomber. When they appeared, they didn't engage in dogfights. They engaged in butchery. They would drop out of the sun in massive, synchronized diving attacks, ripping slow-moving bombers apart with surgical precision. Of all the men aboard the bomber, none held a more terrifying position than the rear gunner. He was trapped in a tiny, vibrating bubble of perspex at the tail of the plane, often with just a single or double-barreled 303 machine gun, the equivalent of firing a rabbit rifle at a tank. His compartment was cramped, freezing, and offered minimal armor protection. He was isolated, with the roar of the engines in his ears and the blinding sun in his eyes, knowing that every attack run ended with the enemy directly in his face. He was the last line of defense, in the position most certain to be shot first. The sheer kill ratio confirmed the strategic failure. Bf 109 seconds and their pilots were destroying the British bomber fleet so efficiently that the survival rate for unescorted missions plunged to terrifying lows. The pilots were trained to fire defensively, weaving and turning in a futile attempt to avoid the cannons. But the tactic was worthless. Entire missions were scrubbed, and objectives were abandoned because of the sheer cost in lives. This was not a war of equals. It was a strategic failure that had left the bomber crews entirely exposed. The stage was set for total annihilation. The man aboard the doomed Blenheim bomber who would ultimately challenge the entire German Air Force was Sergeant Alistair Al Harkness. He wasn't a pilot, not a high-ranking officer, just a meticulous, quiet gunner. But Harkness was a keen observer. While other men simply cleaned their machine guns, he spent his downtime studying photos of crashed German planes. He didn't just worry about the enemy's speed, he learned the geometry of the Bf 109's weakness. He noticed precisely where the pilot was protected, and more importantly, where the engine's vital organs like the vulnerable oil cooler were located. This obsession would soon become the difference between life and death. The stage for this incredible confrontation was the Bristol Blenheim. Even among the sluggish Allied bombers, the Blenheim was notorious for being an easy target. It was slow and quickly becoming obsolete. It was armed defensively, with only a minimal number of 303 machine guns, weapons that often felt more symbolic than effective against the armored German fighters. Flying the Blenheim was like flying a bright red bullseye. When Harkness stepped into his small, cramped turret, he wasn't just preparing for a fight, he was preparing for a funeral. The patrol was routine until the trap was sprung. Suddenly, the radio crackled with the sound of a desperate warning. A massive formation of German fighters, likely Bf 109 seconds, had been spotted. They weren't just passing by. They were making a calculated intercept, heading straight for the slow Blenheim formation. The enemy had the advantage of altitude and position, placing them perfectly to execute a devastating diving attack. Every man's blood ran cold. The pilot and the gunner knew instantly that this was no drill. This was the moment the book predicted they would die. The numbers told the entire, terrifying story. Against the lone Blenheim, there were perhaps a dozen or more of the elite German fighters. Harkness was isolated in his tiny turret, armed with light machine guns. Each Bf-109 was armed with heavier machine guns and powerful cannons designed to tear a bomber's wing clean off. It was a complete mismatch, a textbook execution scenario. According to established military doctrine, the gunner's best bet was to just keep firing until the inevitable happened. There was no way out, no speed to escape, and nowhere to hide. The initial attack began with horrific speed. Before Harkness could even think, the first wave of Bf-109 seconds tore through the airspace. Other bombers in the patrol were immediately struck. Explosions rocked the formation. Planes began to trail smoke, spinning down into the gray English Channel. The sound was deafening, the roar of the diving German engines, the sharp crack of cannon fire, and the frantic rattle of the 303 seconds. The conventional defense tactics had already failed. The other gunners were firing defensively, desperately trying to drive the fighters away. But the Blenheim was still here, and the next wave of attack was already building up. The time for desperate measures had arrived. Harkness saw the incoming slaughter and knew that following the book would mean certain death. He made an unauthorized, split-second decision to break every rule. He knew the Bf-109 seconds would attack from the rear and above, diving fast. Instead of ordering his pilot to execute a slow, defensive turn to present a difficult target, Harkness screamed an unspeakable order. Turn into them. Turn the bomber directly toward the diving attack. His pilot must have thought the gunner had gone mad. They were flying the Blenheim, a sluggish bomber, straight toward the fastest fighters in the world, attempting a head-on collision. The tactic was sheer, terrifying genius. The German Bf-109 was optimized for speed, precision, and attack runs, not defensive dodging. The German pilot expected the slow bomber to turn away, to run, to become an easy mark. But when the Blenheim turned aggressively towards the dive, it shocked the 109 pilots. A head-on approach forced the German fighter to commit to a terrifying decision: maintain their course for a mutual, suicidal collision, or violently abort the attack run. The maneuver completely shattered the Bf-109's attack rhythm, forcing them to break formation and execute high G turns to avoid the Blenheim. As the Bf-109 seconds scattered in confusion and attempted to pull up and away, they presented their largest, most vulnerable profile to the rear gunner. They were no longer small, fast-moving targets. They were large, full-sized planes, momentarily exposed to the full, devastating power of the rear turret. This was the window Harkness had been waiting for. He unleashed everything he had. He didn't fire short bursts. He held the trigger down in a sustained, accurate barrage, aiming precisely at the vulnerable engine faces and oil coolers he had studied in the crash photos. The chaotic counterattack worked with devastating efficiency. The Germans were thrown off their game, and Harkness was scoring direct hits on their weakest points. In a staggering 2 minutes of sheer terror and adrenaline, the impossible happened. Bf-109 seconds began smoking, trailing debris, and spinning out of the fight. Harkness emptied his entire ammunition load, focusing on sustained, accurate strikes against the disoriented enemy. The confirmed number was an absolute shock to the entire command. 12 of the elite attacking fighters were claimed destroyed or severely damaged within that brief, terrifying window. The battle ended as quickly as it began. The remaining German fighters, seeing their comrades go down in flames and realizing the bomber was fighting back with a shocking suicidal aggression, broke off the engagement entirely. They had been taught that the bombers were slow, vulnerable prey. They were not equipped to handle a bomber that charged them head-on. The Bf-109 seconds retreated, leaving behind the wreckage of their broken attack. The slow, obsolete Blenheim, having survived a textbook massacre, continued its patrol. The impossible had been achieved. The Blenheim, miraculously intact, landed safely back at its base. Harkness and his pilot, still running on pure adrenaline, reported their claims: 12 Bf-109 seconds destroyed or seriously damaged in a 2-minute window. Command was highly skeptical, even hostile. Bomber crews were expected to be victims, not executioners. They had seen bomber gunners wildly inflate their kill claims before. How could a slow Blenheim, armed with light machine guns, achieve a kill ratio that elite fighter squadrons would envy? They demanded proof. However, the pilot's testimony, combined with the detailed accuracy of Harkness's description of the engagement and later intelligence from captured German pilots discussing a crazy bomber that flew straight at them, slowly built an irrefutable case. The impossible claim was true. The evidence was too strong to ignore. The Air Ministry understood the massive strategic importance of this single action. This wasn't about one hero. It was about saving the Pruss entire bomber force. Harkness's suicidal move was quickly codified and taught to other gunners. The simple, aggressive defense became known in whispered admiration as the Harkness maneuver. It dictated that when facing a diving attack, the bomber should turn aggressively toward the enemy, forcing the high-speed fighter to execute a difficult avoidance maneuver. The official adoption of this single, unauthorized tactic immediately and dramatically increased the survival rate of unescorted bombers across the entire Royal Air Force. The psychological impact on the German pilots was massive and enduring. They were trained to deal with defensive, fleeing targets, not aggressive, charging ones. They became deeply wary of attacking British bombers head-on. The constant threat of a bomber suddenly turning into a collision course forced the Bf-109 pilots to break off their attack runs earlier, execute their dives less effectively, and fire from longer, less accurate ranges. The aggressive defense bought crucial time for the bombers, reducing the efficacy of the German fighters overnight. Harkness, trapped in his small turret, had used sheer courage and tactical intelligence to fundamentally change the psychological balance of the air war. The incredible action of a single sergeant, trapped in a tin can with an obsolete gun, rewrote the entire manual for bomber defense. His genius was not found in advanced technology or complex new weapons, but in exploiting a simple flaw in the enemy's aggressive psychology. He taught the world that the man in the field, facing impossible odds, sometimes sees the solution that the generals and engineers miss. The ultimate act of defense was to abandon all defensiveness and engage in a calculated, terrifying act of aggression. The legacy of Sergeant Alastair Harkness endures as one of the most remarkable individual feats of the Battle of Britain. His suicidal decision saved countless lives, validated the courage of the Prussian rear gunners, and ensured that the vulnerable British bomber force could continue to fly. The terrifying reputation of a charging Blenheim forced the elite German fighter pilots to respect their targets, making the skies safer for all who flew. Harkness was the humble gunner who, in 2 impossible minutes, changed air combat doctrine across the entire Royal Air Force forever.